January 2026. GitHub. Facebook's React repository. Issue 35499. A developer had discovered that the exhaustive depths rule, the ESLint check React had long recommended to catch hook dependency bugs, was now producing advice that directly contradicted what the React compiler was adding automatically. Two tools, same ecosystem, opposite instructions. The React team's response acknowledged the conflict and noted the documentation would need updating. That is a specific kind of signal. React's core has not broken. The layer of guidance, tooling, and convention that surrounds it has, in 13 years of dominance, grown large enough that different parts of it no longer point in the same direction. The library that launched in 2013 with a clarifying idea that a user interface should be a function of state rather than a sequence of manual mutations, now requires navigating an ecosystem complex enough to contradict itself. Jordan Walk was an engineer at Facebook when he built the first version of React around 2011. The problem was specific. Facebook's newsfeed and ads systems updated constantly, and the existing approach of manually manipulating the document object model to keep the interface in sync with data was producing bugs faster than engineers could fix them. Walk's insight was declarative rather than imperative. Instead of writing code that described how to change the interface, write code that described what the interface should look like for a given state. React handles the rest. The tagline was precise enough to survive 13 years. User interface is a function of state. React was open sourced at JSConf US in May 2013. The initial audience was skeptical. Mixing HTML-like syntax with JavaScript looked like a violation of the separation of concerns. The virtual DOM diffing seemed like overhead. Within a year, the skepticism had largely inverted. The component model was easier to reason about. The declarative approach was more maintainable. In 2015, React Native extended the same model to mobile applications. React was no longer just a web library. February 2019, React 16.8. Hooks. This was the largest API change in React's history. Before hooks, React used class components with lifecycle methods scattered across different functions. Logic was hard to share between components. Hooks replaced this with a simpler model. Use state for state, use effect for side effects, custom hooks for shared logic. The community shifted almost entirely within 18 months. React 16.8 is the dividing line between old React and the version in use today. The failure modes hooks introduced are still the ones most commonly documented: stale closures in use, effect, dependency arrays that are easy to get wrong, and the rules of hooks that make conditional usage impossible. React's documented failure trail is a different category from most front-end frameworks. The core library is stable. There is no production caching bug that only reproduces in one environment. There is no router function that silently fails. The failures that appear in the research period are a category of accumulated friction, and the pattern across all of them is the same. Something that worked stopped working, and the reason was a decision the React team had made deliberately. September 2023, Reddit. React 18's strict mode was calling component functions twice in development. The reason? React was intentionally double-invoking to help developers find impure renders before concurrent features could expose them. It was documented. It was also breaking toggle logic that had worked correctly for years. The explanation was correct. That it surprised so many developers was itself information. June 2024. React 19 changed how Suspense handles parallel rendering. Teams who had relied on the previous behavior needed to update. The upgrade guide documented every breaking change. The documentation was thorough, the migration work was still work. February 2025. Create React App was officially deprecated. The tool that had been the standard starting point for new React projects since 2016 showed deprecation warnings and stopped receiving updates. Thousands of existing projects scaffolded with it were in a dead end. The replacement guidance was clear: migrate to Vite for client-side applications or adopt a full-stack framework. The path was reasonable, the disruption was not small. January 2026. GitHub issue 35499. The exhaustive depths ESLint rule and the React compiler, producing contradictory instructions. Two parts of the official ecosystem, both trying to help, pointing in opposite directions. React in April 2026 is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. That is its complete description. It provides a component model, a reactivity system that re-renders components when state changes, hooks for managing state and side effects, and a reconciler that updates the DOM efficiently. It does not provide routing, a server, a build tool, or opinions about state management. Every React application requires additional choices about all of those things. React 19, released in December 2024, reduced the boilerplate required for the most common patterns. Actions handle async mutations without manual loading state. UseActionState exposes pending state, form results, and reset behavior from a single hook. The use hook reads promises and context during render without the wrapper patterns previously needed. Less code for the same outcomes. October 2025 brought two structural changes. The React compiler reached version 1.0 production ready. It analyzes components automatically and adds memoization where needed, eliminating most of the cases where developers previously wrote use memo and use callback manually. The conflict with exhaustive deps documented in January 2026 is a transitional problem. The ESLint rules designed for manual memoization and the compiler's automated approach have not fully converged. The React Foundation, also announced in October 2025, moves governance beyond Meta's direct stewardship, addressing long-standing community concerns about the library's independence. Stack Overflow's 2025 developer survey recorded React at 44.7% usage, the most used front-end framework in the world. The ecosystem of tutorials, libraries, and available developers reflects that position. A team encountering any React problem is more likely to find a documented solution than with any alternative. React in 2026 is the most used front-end library in the world and the one that requires the most decisions before a project can begin. Routing, pick a library; state management, pick a pattern; build tooling, pick Vite or adopt a framework that has already picked; server-side rendering, not available without a framework. The 44.7% usage number is real. So is the fact that 44.7% of developers using React are not using it the same way. The horror stories are not about crashes. They are about the cost of operating at the center of an ecosystem for 13 years. Create React app accumulated a user base and then became a liability. Hooks introduced a mental model that remains a reliable source of subtle bugs for developers who have not fully understood the dependency system. The React compiler and the linting rules it was supposed to complement are still in the same project at the same time, giving different advice. These are not instability problems, they are complexity problems, and complexity in a code base compounds across every developer who inherits it. For a team that wants maximum flexibility, that is building something unusual enough that no framework's conventions fit cleanly, or that is sharing component logic across web and React Native simultaneously, React as a standalone choice is defensible. The ecosystem supports almost any architecture. The hiring pool is the largest in front-end development. For a team building a standard production web application with routing, server rendering, and SEO requirements, React alone answers none of those questions. A framework answers them. What React provides in that context is the rendering layer underneath, and the guarantee that whatever framework is chosen, the underlying component model will not change. The question in 2026 is not whether to use React. It is how many of its decisions to make yourself and how many to delegate to a framework that has already made them. The library decides nothing. The team decides everything. What gets inherited is both.